Wheelchair-bound girl vanishes in 1990. 3 years later, Dad finds her chair in a thrift store. Before we dive into this deeply moving story of a father's unwavering love and determination, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. This tale will take you through the darkest valleys and highest peaks of the human spirit. Enjoy the story. The silence in Sarah's room was deafening. David Mitchell stood frozen in the doorway, his weathered hand gripping the frame as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. 3 years. 3 long, agonizing years since his beautiful daughter had vanished without a trace. And yet this room remained exactly as she'd left it. The wheelchair ramp he'd built with his own hands still curved gracefully from the hallway into her sanctuary. Adaptive equipment sat patiently in their designated spots. The special grabber tools she'd used to reach her favorite books. The modified desk where she'd spent hours drawing fantastical worlds where everyone could fly. David. Linda's voice drifted from downstairs, tentative and fragile. Are you ready? He wasn't. How could anyone be ready for this moment? The morning light filtered through Sarah's butterfly curtains, casting dancing shadows across walls covered with her artwork. Pictures of soaring birds, children running through meadows, dreams of movement that her 12-year-old heart had never stopped believing in despite the spina bifida that had claimed her legs. His wife had been right, as she usually was. They couldn't keep living in this shrine forever. Other families needed these medical supplies, these adaptations that no longer served their purpose in this house of frozen time. David's fingers traced the doorframe where he'd measured Sarah's growth every birthday. The final mark, just above his waist, would forever represent the last measurement they'd taken together. "She's not coming back," he whispered to the empty room, the words scraping his throat raw. "Is she?" But even as he spoke those devastating words aloud for the first time, something deep in his father's heart refused to accept them. Sarah had been too bright, too determined, too full of life to simply disappear forever. Today, they would finally begin the impossible task of letting go. What David didn't know was that letting go would lead him directly to the truth he'd been desperately seeking. And that truth would shatter everything he thought he knew about his daughter's disappearance. The Goodwill Donation Center buzzed with quiet activity as David and Linda sorted through boxes of Sarah's belongings. Each item felt like removing a piece of their hearts, but they pressed forward with grim determination. "I think that's everything," Linda whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustle of donation bags. David nodded, unable to trust his voice. They'd kept the most precious memories: Sarah's favorite teddy bear, her journal, a few special drawings. Everything else would hopefully bring joy to other families. As they prepared to leave, David's world tilted on its axis. There, in the medical equipment section, sat Sarah's wheelchair. Not just any wheelchair, Sarah's custom-built, personally modified, one-of-a-kind wheelchair. The same chair that featured her collection of butterfly stickers carefully arranged around the armrests. The same chair with the special purple cushion she'd insisted on, claiming it made her feel like royalty. David's knees nearly buckled. "Linda," he croaked, pointing with a trembling finger. His wife's sharp intake of breath confirmed he wasn't hallucinating. The price tag dangled mockingly, $200. "Excuse me," David called to a nearby employee, his voice cracking with desperation. "This wheelchair, where did it come from?" The middle-aged woman looked up from her clipboard. "Oh, that one? Beautiful piece of equipment. Donated about 2 weeks ago by a nice young man. Said he didn't need it anymore." "What was his name?" Linda demanded, appearing at David's side. The employee flipped through her records. "Let me see. Here it is. Marcus Webb. Real polite fellow, seemed genuinely sorry to let it go." The name hit David like a physical blow. Marcus Webb, the enthusiastic volunteer from Sarah's rehabilitation center. The young man who'd shown such special interest in their daughter's progress. David's mind raced as fragments of memory crashed together. Marcus had always been so eager to help, so dedicated to Sarah's therapy sessions. Too dedicated, Linda had once whispered, though David had dismissed her concerns. "Sir, are you all right?" the employee asked, noticing David's pale complexion. But David was already pulling out his phone, dialing Detective Rodriguez's number with shaking fingers. After 3 years of dead ends and sleepless nights, they finally had their first real lead. Marcus Webb had some explaining to do. The drive home passed in stunned silence. David's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white, while Linda stared out the passenger window, lost in troubling thoughts. "We have to call the police," Linda finally said as they pulled into their driveway. "I already did. Detective Rodriguez wants to meet us tomorrow morning," David replied, his voice hollow. Inside their kitchen, they sat across from each other at the table where Sarah used to eat her breakfast, chattering excitedly about her physical therapy sessions. Now that same table felt like an interrogation room. "Marcus Webb," Linda repeated the name slowly, as if tasting something bitter. "I never trusted him, David. Never." David's jaw tightened. "You mentioned that before, but you never told me why." "Because you thought I was being paranoid." Linda's voice rose, years of suppressed worry finally erupting. "You said I was being overprotective, that I saw threats everywhere." The accusation stung because it was true. David remembered dismissing Linda's concerns, praising Marcus for his dedication to Sarah's progress. "He was too interested," Linda continued, her eyes growing distant. "The way he looked at Sarah, the way he'd volunteer for extra sessions. He'd bring her little gifts, books about kids overcoming disabilities, special art supplies for her projects." David felt his chest tighten. "She never mentioned gifts. That's what worried me most. Sarah told us everything, but whenever I asked about her sessions with Marcus, she'd get quiet, secretive." Linda's voice dropped to a whisper. She said Marcus was teaching her special exercises that were supposed to be a surprise. The kitchen suddenly felt suffocating. David remembered Sarah's unexplained absences, times when her therapy sessions ran longer than scheduled. Marcus had always provided reasonable explanations, extra motivation exercises, specialized equipment demonstrations. "How long was this going on?" David asked, dreading the answer. "The last 3 months before she disappeared," Linda replied, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I should have pushed harder. I should have demanded answers." David reached across the table and took his wife's trembling hand. For 3 years, they'd blamed themselves, each carrying private guilt about failing to protect their daughter. Now they had a name. Now they had a direction. Marcus Webb had taken Sarah's wheelchair. The question that terrified them both was, what else had he taken? Detective Rodriguez arrived early the next morning with a thick file and grim determination etched across his weathered face. The kitchen table became command central as they spread out documents from the Sunrise Rehabilitation Center. "I pulled Marcus Webb's volunteer records," Rodriguez announced, adjusting his reading glasses. "What I found is disturbing." David and Linda leaned forward, their coffee growing cold as the detective revealed his findings. Marcus started volunteering at Sunrise 6 months before Sarah's disappearance. His application claimed extensive experience with alternative therapeutic techniques for mobility-impaired children. Rodriguez read from the file. "But here's the problem. None of his references check out." Linda's face paled. "What do you mean? The rehabilitation centers he claimed to work at in Denver? They have no record of him. The certifications he listed? Completely fabricated," Rodriguez explained, his voice growing darker. "This man specifically targeted the Sunrise Center, and based on the session logs, he specifically requested to work with Sarah." David felt sick. The center never verified his background? That's the tragic part. Sunrise was understaffed and desperate for volunteers. They did a basic criminal background check, which came back clean, but they never verified his medical claims or professional experience. Rodriguez pulled out another document. According to these therapy logs, Marcus conducted 12 unauthorized sessions with Sarah in the 3 months before her disappearance. Sessions that weren't on your approved schedule. Unauthorized. Linda's voice cracked. "Sarah never told us about extra sessions. Because Marcus convinced her they were special surprise treatments that would help her walk again," Rodriguez continued. The few notes from legitimate therapists mentioned Sarah becoming increasingly secretive about her progress, claiming she was working on something amazing with her favorite volunteer. David's hands clenched into fists. He was grooming her. That's exactly what this looks like, Rodriguez confirmed. Marcus gained Sarah's trust by promising miraculous results. He isolated her from proper medical supervision, and he filled her head with impossible dreams. The detective leaned back in his chair. I've seen this pattern before. Predators who target vulnerable children often use false hope as their primary weapon. They become the hero who promises to fix what doctors say can't be fixed. Linda began sobbing quietly. She trusted him completely. She thought he was going to make her dreams come true. Rodriguez's expression softened. We're going to find him and we're going to get answers. Marcus Webb made one critical mistake. He kept Sarah's wheelchair. That connects him directly to her disappearance. David stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Somewhere out there, Marcus Webb was living his life while their daughter remained missing. Not anymore. Marcus Webb's suburban home looked deceptively normal: white picket fence, manicured lawn, cheerful flower boxes beneath the windows. David sat in his car across the street, Detective Rodriguez's warnings echoing in his mind. Let us handle this officially. Don't confront him alone. But 3 years of sleepless nights had eroded David's patience. He needed answers now. The doorbell's cheerful chime seemed obscene given the circumstances. Footsteps approached, and David's heart hammered against his ribs as the door swung open. Marcus Webb looked older than his 28 years, with thinning brown hair and nervous eyes that darted past David to scan the street. Recognition flickered across his face, followed immediately by something that looked like panic. Mr. Mitchell? Marcus's voice was higher than David remembered, strained with obvious anxiety. What are you doing here? I think you know exactly why I'm here, Marcus, David replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. I found Sarah's wheelchair at the Goodwill downtown. The donation records show you brought it there 2 weeks ago. Marcus's face went white. He stepped back, partially closing the door between them. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me. David's composure cracked. That wheelchair had Sarah's butterfly stickers, her special cushion, modifications that were made specifically for her body. How did you get it? I bought it from someone, Marcus stammered, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. At a garage sale. I needed it for my grandmother, but she passed away, so I donated it. The lies tumbled out in a rush, each one more desperate than the last. David studied Marcus's face, seeing guilt written in every nervous twitch and darting glance. Your grandmother? David pressed. When did she die, Marcus? What was her name? That's none of your business. Marcus's voice cracked with panic. You need to leave, right now. But David wasn't finished. Where is she, Marcus? Where is my daughter? At the mention of Sarah, Marcus's composure completely shattered. His hands began shaking, and he stumbled backward into his hallway. Get away from my house, Marcus screamed, his voice reaching a hysterical pitch. I'm calling the police. You're harassing me. Call them, David challenged, stepping closer to the doorway. I'm sure they'd love to hear how you acquired my missing daughter's custom wheelchair. Marcus slammed the door so hard the windows rattled. Through the thin wood, David could hear him moving frantically around the house, opening and closing drawers, making frantic phone calls. David returned to his car, but he didn't drive away. Instead, he sat watching the house, noting how Marcus's shadows moved past the windows in agitated patterns. The man was terrified, and terrified people made mistakes. David was counting on it. Absolutely not, David. This is insane. Linda stood in their living room, arms crossed, watching her husband pack a surveillance kit into his backpack. Binoculars, camera, notebook, energy bars, everything needed for a stakeout. Rodriguez said it could take weeks to get a search warrant, David replied without looking up. Marcus is spooked. If he's hiding something, he might try to destroy evidence or run. Then let the police watch him. You're not a detective. You're a grieving father who's about to do something dangerous and stupid. David finally met his wife's eyes. Linda, for 3 years we've sat in this house waiting for someone else to find our daughter. I can't wait anymore. I won't. The argument that followed was their worst in years, but David's mind was made. By evening, he was parked 2 blocks from Marcus's house, watching through binoculars as lights moved behind drawn curtains. The first night revealed nothing unusual. Marcus left for work at 7 a.m., returned at 6 p.m., ordered takeout. A perfectly normal routine that made David question his instincts. But Wednesday changed everything. At exactly 3 p.m., Marcus emerged from his house carrying 2 large duffel bags and a cooler. He loaded them into his van with the careful precision of someone following a familiar routine. Medical supplies, David realized, noting the Red Cross symbols on some packages. The van headed east toward the mountains. David followed at a distance, his heart pounding as they left Cedar Falls behind. The roads grew narrower, winding through dense forest toward areas David had never explored. Where was Marcus going every Wednesday with medical supplies? After 40 minutes of careful pursuit, Marcus turned onto a barely visible dirt road marked only by a weathered private property sign. David parked his car behind a cluster of pine trees and continued on foot. The path led to a clearing where Marcus's van sat outside a small cabin that seemed oddly equipped with power lines and what looked like ventilation systems. This wasn't a hunting lodge or vacation retreat. It was designed for something specific. Through the cabin's windows, David glimpsed equipment that made his blood run cold. Medical devices for stands, what appeared to be examination tables, and covering one entire wall photographs. Even from a distance, David recognized his daughter's smile beaming from dozens of pictures. Marcus had built a shrine to Sarah in the middle of nowhere. David's hands shook as he raised his camera, documenting everything he could see. This wasn't just about finding answers anymore. This was about stopping whatever Marcus was planning to do next. The click of the camera's flash echoed through the forest silence. Fatal mistake. The flash had given him away, but David was too shocked by what he'd discovered to care about stealth anymore. Inside the cabin, Marcus moved with purpose, gathering items from various surfaces while speaking in a low, conversational tone to someone David couldn't see. Crouching behind a fallen log, David strained to hear through the thin cabin walls. "I know you're worried about the timeline, Sarah, but these things take patience." Marcus's voice drifted through a partially open window. "The new treatments are almost ready. Dr. Peterson's research was brilliant, but he didn't understand the spiritual component like I do." David's blood turned to ice. Marcus was talking to Sarah as if she were there with him. "The man who came to my house today, your father, he doesn't understand what we're trying to accomplish," Marcus continued, his voice taking on an almost lecturing tone. "He thinks traditional medicine is the only way, but we know better, don't we?" Through the window, David watched Marcus light candles around what appeared to be a small altar. Photographs of Sarah surrounded a collection of her personal items. A hair ribbon, her favorite pen, the small butterfly pin she'd worn on her jacket. "I've been perfecting the spinal regeneration protocol," Marcus explained to the empty room. "The electrical stimulation combined with the stem cell treatments should restore full mobility within 6 months. You'll be able to dance, Sarah. You'll be able to run through meadows like in your drawings." David realized with growing horror that Marcus had completely detached from reality. In his mind, Sarah was still alive, still receiving his treatments, still believing in his impossible promises. Marcus picked up a wooden box and walked to the back of the cabin. David repositioned himself to maintain visual contact, crawling through underbrush that scratched his face and hands. Behind the cabin, Marcus knelt beside a small mound of earth marked by a wooden cross. Fresh flowers adorned the site Sarah's favorite daisies. "I brought you something special today," Marcus whispered, opening the box to reveal more of Sarah's belongings. A school photograph, one of her drawings, a small diary David had never seen before. "I know the treatments were difficult, but every pioneer faces challenges," Marcus continued, carefully burying the items beside the cross. "When you wake up, when you're finally healed, you'll understand that everything we went through was necessary." The truth hit David like a physical blow. The mound wasn't just a memorial, it was a grave. and Marcus's delusional mind had created an elaborate fantasy where Sarah was simply sleeping, waiting for his miraculous treatments to bring her back. David fumbled for his phone to call Rodriguez, but his hands were shaking so violently he dropped the device. It hit the ground with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the forest like a gunshot. Marcus's head snapped up, scanning the tree line with the alertness of a predator sensing danger. "Someone's here, Sarah," he whispered. "Someone's trying to interrupt our session." David pressed himself against the cold earth, hardly daring to breathe as Marcus stood slowly from beside the grave. The man's demeanor had shifted completely. Gone was the nervous, stammering person from the doorway confrontation. This Marcus moved with predatory confidence. "I can feel you watching us," Marcus called out to the forest, his voice carrying an unnatural calm. "You're disrupting sacred work." David remained motionless, his phone still lying somewhere in the darkness beyond his reach. Through the trees, he watched Marcus return to the cabin and emerge moments later carrying what appeared to be a medical bag and a large syringe. "Sarah's been telling me someone would try to interfere." Marcus continued his one-sided conversation while methodically checking the forest perimeter. "She said her father wouldn't understand the breakthrough we've achieved together." The man was completely detached from reality, but his movements showed tactical awareness that terrified David. Marcus knew these woods, knew how to hunt in them. "The regenerative therapy requires absolute sterility," Marcus explained to his invisible patient as he moved closer to David's hiding spot. "Contamination from non-believers can reverse months of progress." David could hear Marcus's footsteps approaching through the underbrush. In desperation, he began crawling toward where he thought his phone had fallen, leaves and branches crackling beneath his weight. "There you are," Marcus said softly. David looked up to find Marcus standing 10 feet away, the syringe held with practiced competence. Up close, David could see that Marcus's eyes held the fervent gleam of absolute conviction. "You're Sarah's father," Marcus stated matter-of-factly. "She's mentioned you often during our sessions. She's worried that you've given up hope." "Where is she?" David whispered, his voice cracking. "Where is my daughter?" Marcus smiled with genuine warmth, as if David had asked about a beloved mutual friend. "She's resting." The latest treatment cycle was particularly intensive, but the neural pathway reconstruction is proceeding ahead of schedule. The clinical terminology mixed with complete delusion created a horrifying cocktail of madness. David realized that in Marcus's mind, everything he'd done to Sarah had been medical treatment, not murder. "I can show you," Marcus offered, gesturing toward the cabin with paternal pride. "The equipment I've assembled is remarkable. Cutting-edge regenerative medicine combined with holistic healing principles." "Marcus," David said carefully, "Sarah disappeared 3 years ago. She's not in that cabin." For a moment, uncertainty flickered across Marcus's face. Then his expression hardened with renewed conviction. "That's the kind of negative thinking that prevents healing," Marcus replied, raising the syringe. "Sarah warned me you might try to sabotage her recovery. She said you never truly believed she could walk again." David saw his own death in Marcus's eyes, not from malice, but from the terrifying certainty of a man eliminating obstacles to his patient's treatment. The syringe moved toward David's neck. The syringe gleamed in the moonlight as Marcus lunged forward with practiced precision. David rolled sideways, muscle memory from his high school wrestling days kicking in just as the needle whistled through the air where his neck had been. "You're making this more difficult than necessary," Marcus said calmly, adjusting his grip on the weapon. "The sedative will simply help you understand Sarah's treatment process without emotional interference." David scrambled backward through the underbrush, his hands desperately searching for anything he could use as a weapon. His fingers closed around a fallen branch just as Marcus attacked again. The makeshift club caught Marcus across the wrist, sending the syringe flying into the darkness. But Marcus barely flinched, pulling a second syringe from his medical bag with the efficiency of someone who'd planned for resistance. "Sarah's progress depends on maintaining a sterile environment," Marcus explained conversationally, even as he stalked David through the trees. "Your presence is introducing contamination that could set back her recovery by months." David swung the branch again, but Marcus caught it effortlessly, his grip surprisingly strong. Up close, David could see that whatever delusion drove Marcus had also given him physical purpose. The man moved like someone accustomed to subduing struggling patients. "I've treated dozens of cases like Sarah's," Marcus continued, forcing David backward toward the cabin. "Children whose families gave up hope, whose doctors declared them incurable. Traditional medicine has failed them, but my methods work." The clinical detachment in Marcus's voice was more terrifying than any rage. This man genuinely believed he was performing medical miracles, that David was simply another obstacle to overcome. David's back hit the cabin wall. Trapped, he made one desperate gamble. "If your treatments work, show me," David gasped. "Show me Sarah." For a moment, Marcus hesitated, confusion flickering across his features. She's in the recovery phase. The latest neural reconstruction requires complete isolation." "Then show me the equipment," David pressed. "Show me how you're helping her walk again." Marcus's grip on the syringe wavered. "The treatment protocols they're complex. You wouldn't understand the biomechanical principles involved." David saw the crack in Marcus's delusion and pushed harder. "I'm her father. I've researched every possible treatment for spina bifida. Show me what you've discovered." The uncertainty in Marcus's eyes deepened. Somewhere in his fractured mind, the collision between fantasy and reality was creating doubt. That doubt saved David's life. As Marcus hesitated, David managed to activate the emergency alert on his smartwatch, a feature Linda had insisted he enable after his heart attack 2 years earlier. The device would automatically call 911 and broadcast his GPS location. The faint beeping sound snapped Marcus back to deadly focus. "You've called them," Marcus whispered, his face contorting with betrayal. "You've brought contamination to Sarah's sanctuary." The syringe moved toward David's throat with renewed purpose. The needle was inches from David's neck when the forest erupted with light and sound. Police sirens wailed through the trees as searchlights cut through the darkness like blazing swords. "Cedar Falls Police, drop your weapon." Detective Rodriguez's voice boomed through a megaphone, but Marcus seemed oblivious to the chaos surrounding them. His focus remained locked on David with laser intensity. "They're too late," Marcus whispered, his grip tightening on the syringe. "The contamination protocols require immediate implementation." David could hear boots crashing through the underbrush, getting closer by the second. He just had to survive a few more moments. "Marcus, listen to me," David said desperately. "If Sarah is really recovering, she needs you alive to continue her treatments. You can't help her from prison." For a heartbeat, logic seemed to penetrate Marcus's delusion. His hand wavered, uncertainty flickering across his face. "She does need me," Marcus murmured. "The next phase of treatment is crucial. Without proper supervision, the neural pathways could deteriorate." "Then put down the syringe," David urged. "Explain to the police what you've been doing. Show them your research." Marcus lowered his arm slightly, his scientific mind wrestling with his fractured reality. "The documentation is all in the cabin. Charts, progress reports, photographic evidence of tissue regeneration. Drop the weapon now." The shouted command came from directly behind Marcus as 3 officers emerged from the tree line, weapons drawn. Spotlights blazed around them, turning the forest clearing into a theatrical stage. Marcus spun toward the officers, the syringe still clutched in his hand. In that moment, his delusion shattered completely. The police lights, the drawn guns, the reality of his situation crashed down on him like a collapsing building. "No, no, no," Marcus began chanting, backing against the cabin wall. "This will ruin everything. Sarah's treatment schedule, the progress we've made." "Sir, drop the syringe and put your hands above your head," Rodriguez commanded, approaching slowly with his weapon trained on Marcus. Instead of complying, Marcus raised the syringe toward his own neck. "If I can't continue Sarah's treatment, then I've failed her completely." "Don't," David shouted, lurching forward. But Detective Rodriguez was faster. The taser caught Marcus' center mass, sending him convulsing to the ground as the syringe flew harmlessly into the darkness. As officers swarmed around Marcus, cuffing his twitching form, David collapsed against a tree trunk. His legs felt like water, his hands shaking uncontrollably from adrenaline and terror. "David, are you injured?" Rodriguez knelt beside him, checking for wounds. "I'm okay," David gasped. But Rodriguez, he's been living in complete delusion. He thinks Sarah is still alive, thinks he's been treating her. The detective's expression darkened. "We need to search that cabin thoroughly, and we need to find out what's buried behind it." David's heart clenched as he remembered the small mound with its wooden cross and fresh flowers. After 3 years of searching, they were finally going to learn Sarah's fate. Dawn broke gray and somber as the forensics team descended into the cabin's basement, a hidden space Marcus had excavated beneath the floorboards. David stood outside, forbidden from entering the crime scene but unable to leave. Detective Rodriguez emerged after an hour underground, his face ashen. "David, you need to prepare yourself," Rodriguez said quietly. "What we found down there, it's worse than we imagined." The basement had been converted into a makeshift medical laboratory, complete with stolen hospital equipment for drips and monitoring devices. But it was the documentation that revealed the true horror of Sarah's final weeks. Marcus had kept meticulous records, written in the detached clinical language of someone who genuinely believed he was conducting legitimate medical research. Page after page detailed Patient S, Sarah's treatments, her responses, her deteriorating condition. According to these notes, Rodriguez explained, his voice tight with controlled anger, Marcus convinced Sarah she was participating in experimental therapy that would restore her mobility. She went with him willingly, believing she was going to walk again. David's legs nearly gave out. How long? 3 weeks. He kept her here for 3 weeks, subjecting her to increasingly dangerous procedures. Rodriguez's jaw clenched. Electrical stimulation to her spine, injections of unidentified substances, attempts at surgical intervention with no medical training whatsoever. The records painted a picture of systematic torture disguised as treatment. Marcus had documented Sarah's pain, her pleas to go home, her growing fear, all while maintaining his delusion that he was healing her. She died during his final experiment, Rodriguez continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus attempted spinal surgery using equipment he'd stolen from veterinary clinics. The procedure caused massive trauma and infection. David doubled over, vomiting into the grass as the full reality of his daughter's suffering crashed over him. For 3 years, he'd imagined scenarios, kidnapping for ransom, quick accidents, anything but prolonged torture. "There's more," Rodriguez said reluctantly. "The basement contains evidence of other victims, medical files for at least 6 other children with disabilities from surrounding counties, all reported missing over the past 5 years. The scope of Marcus's crimes was staggering. He hadn't just destroyed Sarah's life, he'd built an entire practice around exploiting vulnerable children and their desperate families. Where are the others?" David asked. "We're still searching the property. Ground-penetrating radar shows several disturbed areas in the surrounding forest." Rodriguez paused. Marcus created detailed burial sites for each victim, complete with markers and regular maintenance. In his mind, they're all still his patients, just in different phases of treatment. David stared at the innocent-looking cabin that had concealed such unimaginable evil. He really believed he was helping them. That's what made him so dangerous, Rodriguez agreed. Complete conviction without any actual medical knowledge. He saw himself as a pioneer, breaking new ground in treating disabled children. As if summoned by their conversation, Marcus's voice drifted from the police van where he sat in custody, still talking to his invisible patients about treatment schedules and recovery protocols. Even captured, even faced with evidence of his crimes, Marcus remained trapped in his delusional world where he was a hero rather than a monster. The truth about Sarah was finally emerging, but it brought no peace, only the devastating knowledge of how much she'd suffered while trusting the man who'd promised to make her dreams come true. The interrogation room at Cedar Falls Police Station felt suffocating as David watched through one-way glass. Marcus sat calmly at the metal table, organizing invisible medical charts with the precision of a seasoned physician preparing for surgery. Patient S showed remarkable progress in the initial phases, Marcus explained to Detective Rodriguez, his voice carrying the professional tone of a medical conference presentation. The neural mapping indicated significant potential for regeneration. Rodriguez leaned forward. Marcus, we need you to tell us about Sarah Mitchell. What happened to her? Sarah? Marcus's eyes brightened with genuine warmth. Oh, she's my most promising case. 12 years old, spina bifida, but with incredible determination. Her family had given up hope, but I knew I could help her achieve full mobility. David pressed his face against the glass, watching his daughter's killer speak about her with paternal affection. The disconnect between Marcus's tender expression and the horrific reality was nauseating. Tell us about her treatment, Rodriguez prompted. Marcus's face lit up with professional pride. I developed a revolutionary approach combining electrical nerve stimulation with experimental stem cell therapy. Traditional doctors said it was impossible, but they lack vision. For the next hour, Marcus detailed his treatment protocol with scientific precision. He described how he'd convinced Sarah to participate in secret sessions that would surprise her parents, how he'd built her trust by showing her medical journals and promising miraculous results. She was so brave during the procedures, Marcus continued, his voice thick with admiration. Even when the pain was significant, she trusted me completely. She knew we were making medical history together. Rodriguez maintained his professional composure, but David could see rage building behind the detective's eyes. What happened during the final treatment, Marcus? The spinal reconstruction surgery, Marcus said with scientific enthusiasm. The most complex procedure, but necessary for complete neural restoration. I'd studied the technique for months, practiced on cadaveric specimens. David's hands clenched into fists. Marcus was describing Sarah's death as if it were a routine medical procedure rather than butchery performed by an unqualified madman. The initial incision went perfectly, Marcus continued, lost in his medical fantasy. But Sarah experienced unexpected complications during the neural pathway reconstruction. Her vitals became unstable despite my best efforts. She died on your table, Rodriguez stated flatly. Marcus's expression crumpled with genuine grief. The treatment was so close to success. Just a few more minutes and the neural regeneration would have begun. She would have walked again, run, danced. Tears streamed down Marcus's face as he described creating Sarah's recovery site in the forest, complete with medical monitoring equipment and regular check-ins. In his fractured mind, death was simply another phase of treatment requiring different protocols. I visit her every Wednesday, Marcus whispered. Check her progress, update her charts, bring fresh flowers. The healing process takes time, but I can see improvements in her cellular activity. Rodriguez exchanged glances with the observation window. Marcus, Sarah has been dead for 3 years. You killed her. No! Marcus slammed his hand on the table, his delusion flaring back to full strength. She's responding to treatment. The regenerative therapy requires patience, but the neural pathways are slowly rebuilding. Even confronted with irrefutable evidence, Marcus remained trapped in his fantasy of being a medical pioneer rather than a child killer. Outside the interrogation room, David finally understood the full scope of his daughter's tragedy. She died believing in a miracle that never existed, trusting a monster who genuinely thought he was saving her. The search team worked in reverent silence as they followed Marcus's detailed directions through the mountain forest. Even in custody, he had provided precise GPS coordinates and landmark descriptions for Sarah's recovery site, still maintaining his delusion that she was simply resting between treatments. David walked beside Detective Rodriguez, each step bringing him closer to a reunion he dreaded for 3 years. Linda had chosen to wait at home, unable to face the moment when hope would finally, definitively die. There, Rodriguez pointed ahead to a small clearing where fresh daisies adorned a carefully maintained mound of earth. The sight was heartbreakingly beautiful. Marcus had created an elaborate memorial garden with Sarah's favorite flowers arranged in precise patterns. A handcrafted wooden cross bore her name alongside medical charts tracking her supposed recovery progress. Solar-powered lights ensured the area remained illuminated even at night. He's been caring for this place like a grave site while believing she was still alive, Rodriguez observed quietly. The level of delusion is unprecedented. The forensics team began their careful excavation while David stood at the edge of the clearing, paralyzed by the finality of the moment. For 3 years, he'd harbored secret hopes that maybe Sarah was alive somewhere. Maybe she'd return home. This mound would end those dreams forever. Mr. Mitchell, the chief forensic investigator, approached with professional gentleness. We've confirmed the remains. The dental records are a perfect match. David nodded, unable to trust his voice. After 1,095 days of not knowing, the answer was finally here. The team worked with painstaking care, treating Sarah's remains with the dignity Marcus had denied her in life. As they lifted her small form from the earth, David saw that Marcus had wrapped her in one of her favorite blankets and surrounded her with personal belongings. Her sketchpad, a stuffed animal, even her glasses. He genuinely thought he was caring for her, Rodriguez said, his voice thick with emotion. In his twisted mind, this was a medical facility where she was receiving treatment. David approached the excavation site, kneeling beside the place where his daughter had rested for 3 years. The blanket was one he recognized. Sarah had used it during movie nights on the couch, wrapped up while they watched her favorite films about brave children overcoming impossible odds. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," David whispered to the earth. "I'm sorry it took so long to find you. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from him." The forensic team had also uncovered Marcus's extensive documentation buried alongside Sarah. Medical charts, progress notes, even photographs of the treatment site. All evidence of a madman's delusion that had cost his daughter her life. As they prepared to transport Sarah's remains to the medical examiner, David felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years: relief. Not happiness, not closure, but the simple relief of finally knowing. No more wondering, no more hoping, no more imagining scenarios. Sarah was coming home. The search that had consumed 3 years of his life was finally over. His daughter had been found, and Marcus Webb would face justice for his crimes. But most importantly, Sarah could finally rest in peace, surrounded by family who loved her rather than the delusions of a madman who'd stolen her life while promising to give her everything she'd ever wanted. The nightmare was ending. The healing could begin. St. Mary's Cathedral had never held so many people. The entire community of Cedar Falls seemed to have gathered to honor Sarah Mitchell's memory and witness her family's long-awaited goodbye. David stood at the pulpit, looking out at faces marked by 3 years of shared grief and hope. Sarah would have been 15 years old today, David began, his voice steady despite the tears streaming down his cheeks. She would have been starting high school, probably joining the art club, maybe learning to drive. In the front row, Linda clutched Sarah's favorite teddy bear, the one they'd kept when donating her other belongings. The bear had waited patiently for Sarah's return, just as they all had. "For 3 years, we lived in limbo," David continued. "We couldn't grieve properly because we didn't know if we should hope or despair. Today, we finally say goodbye to our beautiful daughter, and we celebrate the joy she brought to our lives." The service was everything Sarah would have loved. The church overflowed with butterflies, paper ones created by local school children, real ones released by the garden club, artistic ones painted by the high school art department. Her favorite songs filled the sanctuary, performed by the youth choir she'd dreamed of joining. Detective Rodriguez had flown in from Denver, where he'd been reassigned after the case concluded. He approached David after the service, his normally stern expression softened by emotion. "Sarah's case changed everything," Rodriguez said quietly. "The state implemented new background check requirements for volunteers working with disabled children. Her death is preventing others." The Sunrise Rehabilitation Center had undergone complete reforms. Director Patricia Wells, who'd hired Marcus without proper verification, had resigned in disgrace. New protocols now required extensive background checks, multiple references, and ongoing supervision for all volunteers and staff. We're establishing the Sarah Mitchell Foundation, Linda announced to the gathered crowd. It will provide safety training for families with disabled children and fund advocacy programs to prevent predators from targeting vulnerable kids. The most powerful moment came when Jennifer Martinez, a 12-year-old girl with cerebral palsy, wheeled herself to the front of the church. Sarah's custom wheelchair, the one that had led David to the truth, had been refurbished and donated to Jennifer's family. "Sarah's chair helps me go to school and play with my friends," Jennifer said, her voice clear and strong. "She's helping me have adventures, just like she wanted to have." After the service, the procession to Cedar Falls Cemetery was led by dozens of children in wheelchairs, walking aids, and adaptive equipment. They rolled and walked and were carried along the route Sarah had traveled so many times to her therapy sessions, transforming a path of sorrow into one of celebration. At the graveside, David placed Sarah's sketchbook on her casket. Inside were all her drawings of children flying, running, dancing, dreams that Marcus had exploited, but that now inspired others to pursue their own possibilities. "She believed in miracles," David said as the casket was lowered. "Not the twisted fantasies of a sick man, but the real miracles of love, hope, and human resilience." Marcus Webb had been sentenced to life in prison without parole. Even in court, he'd maintained his delusion, telling the judge he was being punished for advancing medical science. But his victims were finally free to rest in peace, their families finally free to heal. Sarah's long journey home was complete. 2 years later, David stood in what had once been Sarah's bedroom, now transformed into the nerve center of the Sarah Mitchell Foundation. Where medical equipment had once sat and used, computers hummed with purpose. Where silence had once reigned, phones rang constantly with calls from families seeking help and guidance. The Colorado legislature just passed the Sarah Mitchell Protection Act, Linda announced, bursting through the door with tears of joy streaming down her face. Mandatory psychological evaluations for anyone working with disabled children, plus criminal background checks updated every 6 months. David embraced his wife, marveling at how far they'd traveled from the broken people they'd been in this very room 5 years ago. Sarah's presence still filled the space, but now it was a presence of purpose rather than paralyzing grief. The foundation had helped implement new safety protocols in 17 states. Their educational programs had trained over 10,000 families to recognize predatory behavior targeting disabled children. Most importantly, they'd created a support network for families of missing children with disabilities, a resource that hadn't existed when they needed it most. "There's someone here to see you," Linda said, stepping aside to reveal Jennifer Martinez, now 14 and radiant with confidence. She wheeled herself into the room with the grace and skill that came from 2 years of using Sarah's refurbished chair. "Mr. Mitchell, I got accepted to the state art competition," Jennifer announced, holding up a colorful certificate. "My painting is called Flying Dreams. It's about Sarah and all the kids who inspire us to keep trying." David knelt beside Jennifer's chair, examining her artwork. The painting showed children with various disabilities soaring through clouds, their adaptive equipment transformed into wings of hope. In the center, a girl with long blonde hair and butterfly wings led the group toward a brilliant sunrise. "Sarah would be so proud," David whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The doorbell chimed, and Linda went to answer it. She returned with a middle-aged couple David didn't recognize, their faces marked by the familiar combination of desperation and determination he'd worn for 3 years. "Mr. Mitchell? I'm Robert Chun, and this is my wife Maria. Our son Tommy disappeared 6 months ago. He has autism and—" Robert's voice broke. "The police say there aren't many resources for families like ours." David and Linda exchanged glances. This was why they transformed their pain into purpose, to ensure no family would face the darkness alone. "You're not alone anymore," David said, guiding the Chens to the conference table where other families had found hope. "We're going to help you find Tommy, and we're going to support you every step of the way." As evening fell, David returned to Sarah's corner of the room, where her artwork still adorned the walls. But now they were surrounded by letters from families they'd helped, photos of children who'd been found, and certificates recognizing the foundation's impact. "We did it, sweetheart," David whispered to Sarah's smiling photograph. "We turned your story into something that protects other kids. Marcus took your life, but he couldn't take your purpose." Through the window, David could see children playing in the neighborhood park, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Some used wheelchairs, some had walking aids, some moved differently than others, but they all played together, protected by laws and awareness that bore Sarah's name. Sarah Mitchell would never walk, never run, never dance, but her legacy ensured that countless other children would have the chance to pursue their dreams safely, surrounded by people who understood that every child, regardless of their abilities, deserved protection, love, and hope. The nightmare had become a mission. The tragedy had become triumph. Sarah's light would shine forever.